Hello students, welcome to Module 4.3.10, Evidences for Evolution. There's a great deal of evidence in support of evolution, and I just wanted to give you some of it. I'm going to go through this rather quickly. So this is just an overview that shows us the major categories that I'm presenting to you. There are even more categories, and there are many, many more examples within each category that I am giving you. And so each evidence topic has a concluding statement that sums up that line of evidence. It has a bullet, this funky bullet symbol like this, and so look for those. The first line of evidence is fossil record. A fossil is a remnant or imprint of past life. Often it's the body of the organism. It can be footprints. Often the skeleton or part of the body becomes mineralized. It can even be fossilized feces or turds. They call those coprolites. So a fossil can be a wide range of things. The Earth's crust has been laid down in layers called strata. One layer is called a stratum. Older strata are deeper, and younger strata are shallower. Older strata contain more primitive fossils, and more recent fossils are found in shallow strata, and these are most similar to living organisms. And so when we look at the fossil record, we find the sequence of fossil organisms is logical and consistent with the theory of evolution. There are numerous intermediate forms that we find, what people in the past have called missing links, no longer missing. That's not a term that evolutionary biologists really use, is missing link, because, well, anyway. A few dates that you should know with regard to the fossil record. The age of the Earth is estimated to be 4.6 billion years. The oldest life, 3.8 billion years or so, is, and these are microfossils because we're talking about bacteria. The age of the first eukaryotes, the first cells with nuclei, is about 2 billion years. The age of the first multicellular life forms is 800 million years, or 0.8 billion years. So these are some good dates that you should be somewhat familiar with. But the fossil record really is a chronological sequence from very simple forms, from bacteria to more complex organisms through time. This is very strong physical evidence of evolution, and it really supports the compelling case for biological evolution. This shows some of the geological time scale up here. We're not going to memorize any of that terminology for this class. Fossils of human ancestors are also compelling evidence of the fact that humans have evolved, and so we can see all sorts of interesting things. On the right, we can see a modern human, and then something called Homo floresiensis, hard to say, on the island of Flores in Indonesia. These are the ones they call the hobbits, and they are only thought to be about 25,000 years old. Now, there may be a revision in that dating, but right now it's really quite remarkable because their cranial capacity is so different. Anyway, here's a family tree of some of the fossils of humans, and here is probably a more compelling one. Look at skull A, which is a chimpanzee, and look at the series of human fossils that we find in between with increasing cranial capacity. It's very interesting. Here's a modern human. Your skull would look something like this, Homo sapiens sapiens. So we have this, I don't know where the missing link is. Again, it's a term that evolutionary biologists don't use. We have many fossils of invertebrates, animals without backbones. Trilobites are an extinct type of arthropods. There are no longer living trilobites as far as we know. Archaeopteryx is an intermediate form between birds and reptiles. Very famous fossil found in limestone deposits in Germany. There are lots of fossils, and I just have one more page here. There's a fossil bat. There's a fossil ichthyosaur, which is actually a reptile that ecologically made its living the way dolphins do, by catching fish. here's a duck-like bird, which I can't make out. I don't even know why I have that in there. I think it's for this, the oldest land plant, Cooksiana. That's a way to start a fight amongst paleobotanists because they don't agree on which is the oldest land plant. It's kind of funny. Anyway, a second line of evidence is biogeography. Biogeography is the study of the distribution of living organisms. And it turns out that if we want to find the closest ancestor of, say, species that live on an island, we don't look at other islands for a general island type of organism. Rather, we look at the nearby continents, the nearby mainlands, and we find that the closest ancestor is there. For example, the ancestor of Darwin's finches was from South America, the nearby continent. And we find the same thing in mountains and in deserts. We don't have a general overall type, but we have types that are closely related to types that live adjacent. So species all over the world are most closely related to those that live nearby. And this is a pattern that is best explained by descent with modification by the theory of evolution by natural selection. An example of this, and this is interesting because we get to introduce a little bit of physical science here in terms of plate tectonics. The continents have not always been where they are now. In the past, there were supercontinents. One of them was called Gondwana. That was a southern supercontinent, and we believe it is on the supercontinent of Gondwana where a type of bird evolved that is called a ratite. Ratites are walking birds. They don't fly, and so their breastbone is flat. The breastbones of most birds is keeled. It has a blade-like projection for the attachment of flight muscles, but not these. These include the ostriches, the emus, the cassowaries, the rheas, and so it's kind of interesting that those all have a southern distribution because they originated when Gondwana was together, and then they have evolved into separate species on the separate continents as they have separated. And so we have rheas in South America, ostriches in Africa, moas in Madagascar, elephant birds in Madagascar, moas in New Zealand, emus in Australia. And so you can see this interesting pattern. And apparently none of the ratites went to India. India actually came from Gondwana and went northward, and when it collided with the Asian plate, it created the Himalayas. So kind of interesting. I always love the bumper sticker, though. Reunite Gondwana. Sounds like some African political movement. Of course, it's just paleontology. All right, the third line of evidence is taxonomy. Taxonomy is the study of naming and grouping of organisms, and the existence of recognizable groups of organisms actually suggests different degrees of relatedness. The fact that we can recognize a dog family and a cat family actually means that they had a more recent common ancestor. For example, wolves and dogs are more closely related than either wolves and foxes or dogs and foxes. And so this is kind of an interesting thing. It has to do with evolutionary distance. And so there's a dog family on the left and a cat family on the right. And so we can conclude this and say anatomical similarities of different groups of organisms reflect different evolutionary lineages. We can also look at comparative anatomy. It's closely related to taxonomy because taxonomy is based on this. This is the comparison of physical structure. And so if we look at the skeletons of humans and gorillas, and here they are right here, they are quite similar, and that suggests a recent common ancestor, but they're very different from the much more distantly related pill bug, if we look at the form there. And so this is just really more of the taxonomy, only under a different name of comparative anatomy. There are two lines of evidence that fall under comparative anatomy: homologous structures or homology, and vestigial structures. We'll look at each of them in turn. Homology is similarity of structure, physiology, or behavior due to common ancestry. So the fact that human and gorilla skeletons are similar, or vertebrate forelimbs. And just by way of contrast, analogy or analogous structures are similarity of structure, physiology, behavior derived from separate evolutionary origin. For example, all wings don't come from the same origin. Insect wings are outfolding of the body, and bird wings are from the forelimbs. of vertebrates. And we use four limbs of vertebrates as an example of homology. If we look at the front legs of vertebrates in different groups, we can find the same skeletal structure: one long bone, two long bones, many short bones, or what we call wrist bones, and then 5 phalanges. And we have the digits can be reduced in number, for example, on cats, although they can have a dew claw, a dew toe, and we can see these different patterns over and over again in these different groups. And that gives us a strong evidence. So homology, the pentadactyl limb, that's having 5 digits, is ancestral to all vertebrates. Even snakes, which have no vertebrates, had ancestors that had pentadactyl limbs, but it has been widely modified in different forms for different uses. And you can kind of contemplate these as you look around at the illustrations of the different vertebrate animals in this illustration. Again, homology and analogy, you can look at this. These wings are considered analogous because the bat wing comes from the whole hand. The bird wing has actually a large amount of arm bones in it. And the butterfly wing, of course, is from the body, so they're considered to be from slightly different places. Also, we need to consider vestigial structures under comparative anatomy. These are a vestigial structure is a structure with little or no current function that had a function in a past ancestor. And in humans, there's a bunch of these things, and here's some of them. Consider the vermiform appendix, the ear muscles that can move your ears. I can't move my ears, but I knew a kid in 6th grade who could. Nictitating membrane. If you've ever been petting a cat and it opens its top eyelid and its bottom eyelid, and all of a sudden, whoosh, there goes another eyelid. You go, what was that? Many vertebrates have a 3rd eyelid. In humans, it's just reduced to a little vestigial structure in the corner of the eye. Caudal vertebra, which is to say tails in humans. Humans typically aren't born with tails, although some are. The tail is typically reabsorbed before birth. If it's not, we typically snip them off in Western countries. Wisdom teeth is one of my favorites, and wisdom teeth is a 3rd molar in your back. So what has happened is, as human evolution, the faces of humans have become flatter and flatter, and so the tooth row has become shorter, and there's not enough room for all of the teeth, the wisdom teeth, and so we have to have them typically removed. But I don't have any wisdom teeth. I was born without them. The dentist says about 1 in 200 people. I don't know where he got that figure, but that's what he told me. And so I regard that as a sign that I am highly evolved. Ho, ho, ho. All right. Anyway, so those are some of the vestigial structures in humans. There are others I didn't really talk about there, but notice the conclusion. Homologous and vestigial structures are indicators of biological history and provide more evidence for evolution. They suggest an evolutionary process whereby structures are redesigned and or abandoned. And so it's interesting to see these. Here are leg bones in snakes, but I don't consider these to be truly vestigial because this is a python and only males have these vestigial femurs, and they actually have a use. A vestigial structure is one that has a very limited function, but these are actually used to stimulate the female during mating, and the females don't have them. So I don't know. It's one of those gray areas, I suppose, but still interesting to consider. I didn't really talk about the appendix before, but in humans, the appendix is just this little dead-end sac. In other species, it can serve as what was called a fermentation sac, and that is, for example, consider a koala. It eats primarily eucalyptus leaves. Those leaves have very low calories and very low nutrition, and so to help digest what is there, we have this fermentation sac where many symbiotic bacteria live and help to break down the leaves more fully. Now, the evidence is that humans in the past had a larger appendix, but our diet changed, and so we have a very small one, and now it just serves virtually no function, but it can be a place that can become infected, and if it does so and it bursts, it can be you can die unless you receive a surgical repair, appendicitis. It's very, very dangerous. A fifth line of evidence is comparative embryology. This is when we look at embryos of different species. And the developmental process is quite sensitive in an evolutionary sense, so it's conservative. In other words, if you have a mutation there, it will screw things up so that typically that lineage is not viable. And so the original embryological sequences have often been conserved, and that's what we mean when we say it's conservative in an evolutionary sense. And so we can actually look at different stages in the embryological development, and they can actually resemble species from which lineages are derived. For example, developing organisms often pass through stages that share features with ancestors from which they evolved. For example, the embryos of all vertebrates appear very similar, with each possessing a tail and gill slits. This includes humans. And so we can look here on the top. These are actually photographs. You can see they look quite different. Down here is a series of drawings that were done by Ernst Haeckel, and he exaggerated the similarity to a fairly large extent. And this is something that anti-evolution people take great joy in saying, well, look, it's not like that. But in fact, the embryos are relatively similar, and they do have tails and gill slits. And so it's quite remarkable. And so these are drawings, again, that are probably Haeckel's, after Haeckel, if you look in the early stage. And then you get more differentiation with greater age, and you can actually see turtles and birds and pigs and humans, and kind of interesting. These are actual photographs of the development of a human embryo. Pretty fascinating stuff. And so you can see gill slits and a tail clearly, little eye spot, and then leg and arm buds, developing toes and whatnot. The brain is not developed at all yet, but kind of interesting. All right, another line of evidence is comparative molecular biology. This says that an organism's genes and products of those genes provide a record of heredity. So if you have more similar molecules, then you're more closely related. Especially we've looked at DNA and proteins, the sequence of amino acids, which are the monomers of proteins. And so we can see these things. So comparative molecular biology confirms and elaborates upon the accounts established by other evidences of evolution, such as comparative anatomy and the fossil record. More molecules in common correlates with relatedness. Now, here, if we ask what is the closest ancestor of a chimpanzee, you might think it's a gorilla, but well, no, it's not. It's definitely a human. Humans and chimpanzees share over 97% of their DNA, making humans, not gorillas, the closest living relatives of chimpanzees. And this shows the kind of studies. This is an older study because it's using amino acids, and now we're using more and more DNA. But it shows, for example, in one of the proteins in the electron transport chain, which you'll recall is used in cellular respiration, and all organisms need to produce ATP from their food, and so they have this. And so cytochrome C is a molecule that's used in there, and so they often use it to compare across a wide variety of organisms. We can see that cytochrome C of humans and chimpanzees is identical. In rhesus monkey, there's one difference, and this is out of about 104 total amino acids in human cytochrome C. In a rabbit, there's 9 differences. In a cow, there's 10. In a pigeon, there's 12. In a fruit fly, there's 24. In wheat germ, there's 37. In yeast, there's 42 differences. So it's kind of interesting. We can see something. This is a comparison done with hemoglobin, the protein that carries oxygen in the red blood cells. And again, we can see that this is out of 574 amino acids. The macaque has 8 differences. A dog has 32 differences. A bird has 45. A frog has 67. And a lamprey, which is a jawless fish, has 125. Another line of evidence this provides evidence for the validity of evolution is artificial selection. Of course, this is selective breeding. Artificial selection is defined as increased survival and reproduction of the organisms that are selected by humans. And so this is what we've used in agriculture and this kind of thing. And so the conclusion here, the parallels between artificial selection in which humans select and natural selection in which the environment selects are strong evidence of the power of differential reproduction. Now here's a cartoon. Here's Farmer Jones. He's going to go slaughter a chicken, and look at that one with a long neck. He's in trouble. Okay, an 8th line of evidence is microevolution. Microevolution is evolution or change in gene frequency within a single species. And an example of this is the developed resistance to antibiotics by bacteria and developed pesticide resistance in insects. These are both powerful examples that demonstrate the factual reality of the evolutionary process. So here in the first Petri dish, this is over time, the same dish shown 3 times. It shows a genetically diverse colony treated with an antibiotic, and then the few immune survivors recolonize or reproduce and repopulate. And so this is what happens with antibiotics. So the establishment of evolution as a fact within a species is very good evidence that similar processes lead to speciation. As Darwin said, such a logical extension of the evolutionary process is a difference of degree and not of kind. And so evolution has been shown to be a fact within a species, and is well supported by a preponderance of the evidence as a process leading to diversification of one species into 2 or more. In other words, macroevolution. And this actually shows evolved resistance in pesticides. If you look at number 1, we have a diverse population treated with pesticides. Those susceptible ones, which, by the way, have the green genes, and the one with the red gene is resistant, and the ones with the green genes die. The pesticide serves as a selective force in the environment, and the red one survives and serves to repopulate. And so we get resistant insects to pesticides. This is also a big problem. So going through that evidence, we come now to the last slide of the presentation, and we say that speciation, of course, is a source of biological diversity, and this is one of the most valuable and yet one of the most severely threatened global resources. And learning about evolution and speciation will allow us to understand the management of biological diversity and really appreciate that it is irreplaceable. And an additional benefit may be that we may come to better understand the source of the major threat to biodiversity, which ironically is also one of the products of speciation. And that product of speciation is us, it's people. And so people are threatening the products of evolution, which are the other species with which we share the planet. And we'll close here. Kind of interesting. This is a picture taken by one of my friends. I think that's supposed to be applause. I'm not sure. Anyway, this concludes this module.